When debt turns into influence, debt begins as a tool, a way to move resources through time, a bridge between ambition and capacity. But when it grows large enough and spreads widely enough, it stops behaving like a simple obligation and starts behaving like power. This matters today because modern systems no longer treat debt as neutral. They organize around it, depend on it, protect it, and in doing so, they allow debt holders to shape outcomes far beyond repayment schedules. To understand how this shift happened, we have to look at scale. Small debt constrains a borrower. Large debt constrains everyone else. When obligations grow big enough, their survival becomes a shared concern. Decisions begin factoring in not just what is fair, but what is necessary to keep the system functioning. At first, this influence is subtle. Large borrowers receive flexibility. Deadlines are extended. Terms are adjusted, not because rules disappear, but because enforcement carries consequences. The cost of strict discipline starts to outweigh the benefit. This is a reveal beginning to form. Debt changes position when failure becomes unacceptable. What started as a liability becomes leverage. Those who will the most gain a voice, not through threat, but through importance. Their stability becomes system stability. Institutions adapt quickly to this reality. Risk is assessed differently at scale. Enforcement becomes selective. Negotiation replaces penalty. Debt is no longer just something to be repaid. It is something to be managed. The early tension forms here. Influence does not come from intention. It comes from dependency. When too many outcomes rely on a single obligation continuing to exist, that obligation gains protection, and protection reshapes power. Markets sense this shift immediately. Large debts are priced differently. Risk premiums compress. Confidence flows toward size. The system signals, quietly but clearly, that some obligations matter more than others. When debt turns into influence, the rules do not change overnight. They bend. And once bending becomes routine, the structure of power begins to move with it. What began as a promise to pay becomes a reason to be preserved. And preservation at scale is influence. As debt accumulated, the system began reorganizing itself around its preservation. Decisions were no longer evaluated only by efficiency or fairness, but by impact on stability. Large obligations shape policy indirectly, simply by existing. Institutions adjusted behavior accordingly. Enforcement softened where consequences felt too large to absorb. Restructuring replaced resolution. Time became the primary tool for managing exposure. Debt was extended, rolled, and refinanced, not because risk vanished, but because confronting it felt dangerous. Markets absorbed this logic quickly. Size signaled safety. Scale attracted capital. The larger the obligation, the more confidence it inspired. Not because repayment was guaranteed, but because intervention seemed likely. Risk pricing inverted quietly. This is where the reveal deepened. Debt had crossed a threshold. It no longer represented just future payment. It represented future consequence. Decisions were made to avoid triggering those consequences, even when doing so distorted incentives. Behavior adapted across the system. Borrowers optimized for scale. Growth became protection. Larger balance sheets commanded patience. Smaller ones faced discipline. Influence flowed not from performance, but from potential disruption. The early conflict sharpened beneath the surface. When debt confers influence, accountability weakens. Success is rewarded with flexibility. Failure is deferred rather than resolved. The system remains stable, but tension accumulates in unaddressed obligations. Participants sense the imbalance. Discipline existed, but unevenly. Rules applied, but selectively. The system justified this as pragmatism. Stability demanded compromise. Order required accommodation. Debt had not corrupted the system. It had repositioned it, from enforcing obligation to managing consequence. And when consequence outweighs contract, power quietly shifts. The question ahead was no longer how much debt could be carried. It was who would decide when it mattered. The conflict reached its emotional peak when influence began shaping outcomes before decisions were even made. Not through pressure, but through anticipation. Policymakers hesitated. Lenders paused. Markets waited. Everyone understood what could not be allowed to fail. This was the heart of the tension. Debt had stopped being reactive. It was now proactive. Its sheer presence narrowed the range of acceptable choices. Actions were filtered through a single question: what happens if this obligation breaks? Institutions felt this constraint immediately. Hard decisions were postponed. Losses were softened. Restructuring replaced resolution again and again. The system was not avoiding responsibility. It was managing fear. Fear of cascading consequences no one fully controlled. Markets reflected this reality with precision. Prices moved less on fundamentals and more on expectations of protection. Large borrowers traded with implicit support. Smaller ones faced volatility alone. Influence had become asymmetrical. The emotional weight of this moment came from realization. Debt had rewritten discipline. The system still enforced rules, but only where enforcement was survivable. Where consequences were too large, flexibility replaced accountability. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The more influence debt carried, the more incentive there was to grow it. Size became strategy. Expansion became insurance. The system unintentionally rewarded accumulation over prudence. The buildup was complete. Debt had fully transformed from obligation into leverage, not because anyone planned it, but because dependency demanded it. The question was no longer whether debt could be repaid. It was whether it could be allowed to fail. And once failure becomes unacceptable, influence is no longer earned. It is assumed. The resolution did not come from eliminating debt or stripping it of influence. That was never realistic. It came from confronting the trade-off the system had been avoiding. The climax arrived with a hard acknowledgement. When debt is allowed to shape outcomes indefinitely, it stops serving the economy and starts governing it. Stability purchased through perpetual accommodation carries a hidden cost, eroded discipline and distorted incentives. In response, boundaries were slowly reintroduced, not through sudden punishment, but through clearer limits. Expectations were reset. Support became conditional rather than assumed. The system began distinguishing between protecting stability and preserving influence. This shift was uncomfortable. Some obligations were forced to adjust. Losses were recognized rather than postponed. Size no longer guaranteed flexibility in every situation. Debt retained importance, but it lost its automatic authority. The resolution reshaped how power was understood. Influence was no longer derived solely from scale, but from sustainability. Obligations were evaluated not just by their consequences if they failed, but by their behavior while they survived. What endured was a crucial lesson. Debt becomes dangerous not when it exists, but when it is protected from consequence entirely. Stability requires allowing some obligations to end, so the system can remember why discipline matters. When debt turns into influence, the system must decide where the line is drawn, because influence without accountability does not preserve order. It replaces it. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. When debt